Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my end of the season deep dive series. I start from the back of the pack and work my way to the front of the pack, going through the constructors. And so today I will be talking about Kick Sauber and doing a deep dive into Kick and their drivers and their championship and the teams around them in that spot relative to where they ended up, as well as the drivers and where they ended up in the drivers championship, and kind of getting a look and kind of comparing those drivers to roughly where those other drivers and constructors, landed at the end of the season around them. Now, Kick was kind of a interesting development as they were dead last year, and so they kind of moved up to that 9th position. They, really only had 4 points last year, so a whole 70 points was a really big, improvement from last year, but they still were kind of at that bottom end. There was mainly because that midfield was so tight, the ranges between that, the positions were so close together, those hundredths of a second between several different positions on the grid made it really tough to get into those. And they were a little bit inconsistent, so they couldn't get up into those points on a consistent basis, and so they ended up into that 9th place. It was also partly due to the transitioning from that, stake Kick Sauber car over to Audi, and that probably didn't lend too much to a true development of that car throughout the year and getting that backing behind it, as they knew they were transitioning to a different team next year. So that kind of hurt them in that regard, in my viewpoint, even though they did really well compared to last year. So that's a good improvement for them from last year to this year, getting into the 9th place instead of being dead last, going from 4 points all the way up to 70 points this year. So all of that was really good. Now, if you start comparing the drivers, so you start looking at Bortoleto versus Hulkenberg, you can see that Bortoleto, outdid a sprint qualifying 3 out of 6 times to his teammate, and outperformed him in those sprint qualifying tests 4 out of 6 times. So he was doing really good in those sprint races, whereas Hulkenberg was lacking a little bit in that regard. Now, if you go over to the GP races, he outqualified Hulkenberg 12 out of the 24 times, so about even half between which driver qualified the other person in those GP races. But as for the race itself, he only outbeat his teammate 10 out of those 24 times. So Hulkenberg kind of came back in the races, as you expect a more experienced driver to be able to pull out a little bit more in those longer races in that regard. So if you just do a quick look at Hulkenberg, it kind of fits that same reverse scenario. So he outqualified Bortoleto 3 out of the 6 times, and on the sprint races, he only beat him 2 out of the 6 times in those sprint races. But for the GP races, it was a nice even split. 12 out of 24 times he beat his teammate on the qualifying session, and on the final race of those GP races, in results, it was 14 out of those 24 times that Hulkenberg outbeat Bortoleto. So that was all a nice even keel for some of those drivers. Of course, as you can see here, we have the Kick was in 10th place as of last year and is in 9th place as of this year. Their average starting sprint position was 13.8. Their average finishing for the sprint races were 14.4, so a little bit down on that, not quite moving up like they should be. And that kind of follows suit a little bit with the GP races, where they started qualifying in that 14.5 marker, but moved up only one spot to that 13.5 marker at the end of those GP races. Now, that was a nice, good increase as a 1.1 position overall, but it wasn't quite into the position they needed to land that 13th position instead of that 10th position where they could, generally get points. So that kind of hurt them in that regard, but they were still making progress throughout those full GP races. They had a total of 8, DNFs, and those are all happened in the GP races. And if you break that down into the drivers, you can see that Gabriel Bortoleto ended up in 19th. He had an average sprint, qualifying position of 14.8 and moved that up to a 13.7 on those in qualifying races. So he's gaining a little bit of ground on those sprint races, about a position, but again, not quite where those points resided. So he's kind of back in that backfield. So that was a good improvement, but not quite where they needed to be. And for the GP races, he started off roughly in that 14.2 and basically stayed there for the end of those GP races. So he ended up with a 14.3 average finishing position for those GP races. And he had 5 of those DNFs that were for the team. Now, his teammate, Nico Hülkenberg, last year was in 11th position, and he stayed in 11th position. His average sprint qualifying position was 12.7, and he went down on that for the sprint races to a 15.2. So not a great run for him on those sprint races. But if you go back up to the GP races, his average qualifying position was 14.7, and he moved that up to a 12.2. So a really good improvement on those GP races, on those end results. But again, not quite where those points were on average. So he would get up into those points, but drop back for the most part to that 12th to 13th position in this regard. And he had 3 of those DNFs. So this is a comparison between the 2 teammates in those sprint races and the end results. So this is the finishing position for each of those drivers in those 6 races. And so the lower that is, the better they are. So the farther up on that grid that they ended up. And so if you look at those trend lines, the downward trend line is a better marker, saying that they were actually improving throughout this season. And the upward one, like for Nico Hülkenberg, was getting slightly worse throughout the season on those sprint races. So it's not that great run for Nico Hülkenberg, but for Gabriel Bortoleto, it is a nice improvement throughout this year. Gaining ground as that rookie, figuring out that car, figuring out how to best utilize the tools that were given him throughout this season. So here we move over to the comparison for Gabriel Bortoleto to the 2 drivers that ended up around him in that driver's standing at the end of the year, and we're just comparing those on those sprint races. So we look here at Gabriel in the green, Franco Colapinto in that blue, who kind of came out a little bit later in the season, and Pierre Gasly, of course, in the pink. And so you can look at those and kind of compare how well they were doing to each other in this scenario. And so you can kind of look at that and see Gabriel is getting better throughout the season, whereas Franco and Pierre Gasly were getting worse throughout the season. Now, partly that's due to the development of the cars and how well they can kind of react to those situations and take advantage of those car setups in that regard. But on other ones, it is driver improvement and how well that works as well. So it all kind of combines in this nice little graph here, kind of showing you race by race where people ended up, in those finishing positions for the sprint race and how they compared. So it's kind of a up and down mix for most of these drivers, as you can look at that, as those inconsistencies show in those cars. But you can kind of get a nice idea of how well they did compared to each other in those sprint races. And here's a graph showing Nico Hülkenberg in those same scenarios with Isaac Hajar and Fernando Alonso. And you can kind of see here that Nico was pretty stable, but getting slightly worse. But you could also see that Isaac Hajar was getting better throughout the season. And then Fernando Alonso was getting better also throughout the season. So that was going to seem to overcome him in these sprint races, getting better throughout the season. Whereas Nico was kind of getting worse, not quite being able to keep up with the rest of those drivers in the sprint races. But what I like here is that, Nico Hülkenberg is pretty steady around that 15 marker, whereas you can see that, Fernando Alonso had that really good start, coming in that 10th place, and then have some back markers, and he came back in Brazil and Qatar doing fairly well in those sprint races. And so you're trying to figure out how well that works in the average marker. And then you can see Isaac Hajar coming down, throughout the season pretty steadily. And you can kind of see that in this graph with those, results from Belgium. And then kind of dropping back a little bit in Austin, but coming back down to that same pattern in Brazil and Qatar for Isaac Hajar. And so you can kind of compare those to Nico Hülkenberg in that Kick Sauber car and seeing how well they compare to each other and see how that works. Now we'll get back into the GP races here in a second. And here we're comparing the two Kick Sauber cars, teammates against each other in the GP races. So this is a little bit of a different result than we see in the sprint races, where we see Gabriel starting off pretty slowly, but kind of getting better, but kind of erratic throughout the rest of the season, where we see Nico Hülkenberg, get a little bit more steady across the board, even though he was kind of erratic as well, but getting a little bit more steady on that higher end positioning that he ended up. And you can see those through those trend lines there. So you can see that, Gabriel is getting better throughout the season, decently throughout the season, also, going through from that, 16th position down to that, 12th or 11th position, whereas Nico Hülkenberg is nice, steady across the board, across the whole season, even though that car is getting a little bit more erratic between those sessions in those races. But it's kind of interesting to see that it's not just the car that's relative, because you can see the difference relaying in those positions between the two teammates. And again, we see, Gabriel Bortoleto in that green here, comparing to those two drivers around him, so Franco and Pierre Gasly. And I did find it really interesting that this year seems to be a lot more erratic, a lot more inconsistencies between, all of the races, where they're having some highs and lows all the way across the field in this scenario. But you kind of have to drill down into those to figure out what those averages were, how well they were doing in that regard. So in this case, Gabriel's getting better again, and Franco and Pierre Gasly were getting worse throughout this season as their positions, fell back towards the back of the pack the longer that season went. But we did have some nice standouts from Pierre Gasly, where he did some fairly good stuff, like in Bahrain, and then back to the end of the season, he kind of had that 3-run, in Mexico, Brazil, and Vegas, or maybe it was Qatar, that he had those nice 3 runs in that regard to show how well he ended up in that run. Get a little bit of edge on his teammate, being able to get the most out of that car. And of course, you can see Gabriel Bortoleto finding his way, trying to get back down into that scenario. But as that car has been on the edge there, it's really hard to get a good steady grind on that to figure out where he's going to be. And as we dive into Nico Hülkenberg's and compare him to that Isaac Hydjar and Fernando Alonso here, you can see that, again, Nico Hülkenberg's pretty consistent across the board, where, Fernando Alonso's kind of starting off in the back and then was working way up through the field as the season went on. And then Isaac Hydjar was, started off at a decent spot in that 10th place roughly, and basically staying there, but getting a little slightly better throughout the season as well. So he's not quite taking full advantage of that car at the end of the season like he was at the beginning, or that car didn't improve quite as well it did in that regard. And you can kind of edge that out through the driver or through the car potentially in that regard. But you can see that he's, on the top range of that, where Fernando Alonso was a little bit farther back, but then had some more spikes in that regard. And and Nico Hülkenberg in that green kind of had ups and downs quite significantly in these scenarios. So he had that nice start, but then had several, at the back of the pack, and then he had a couple of good runs, and then fell back in the pack again and had 1 or 2 good runs as well. So it's kind of more inconsistent for Nico Hülkenberg in that Kick Sauber car, but you can kind of get those averages out and kind of get a decent job, I guess, looking at those people that kind of finished around him to see how well he did compared to those drivers. And here we compare the points, kind of like we did for the teams, but, getting all those points and figuring out where they were scored for each driver. This is the combination of GP races and sprint races in that regard. So you can kind of look at those and kind of compare how well they did to each other, on race by race basis for those points, and kind of get those trend lines. As you can see, Gabriel Bortoleto's is going up slightly in that regard, getting more points at the end of the season than he did at the beginning of the season, which you can kind of expect from a rookie in this, trying to get the feel for that, trying to pull all that information on how best to run that car, all the buttons on the steering wheel to get the best performance for each lap, and being consistent on that regard versus, the experienced driver who knows how to, get those car dialed in as much as possible. And then you get those spikes in there, but you can kind of get a good average there. And this is the same information, but just on a step graph. So you can kind of see throughout the year how they related to each other and where those jumps were, compared to each other in that, driver's standing. So you can see that, Hulkenberg started off with points, and then they kind of had nice even out with no points until Monaco or, Austria, where they started gaining some more points, in that regard. But, Nico Hulkenberg had a pretty big gap there in that regard, and they kind of leveled out again till the end where, Nico Hulkenberg started gaining a little bit more points at the end of the season as well. Now we dive into the team as a whole, and so you can look at here at Stake in the green and the Alpine in the pink and Haas in the red compared to those teams around them in that constructor standings. And this is an interesting graph just because Stake had no points in these sprint races, and so you see them at the very bottom there where we have Alpine gaining some points in the sprint races in Miami and Brazil, where Haas did a good bunch of points in Belgium. So that kind of just interesting thought pattern there on where they got points in the sprint races. And of course, this is how it looks on the step graph. So you can see that, Stake was at the very bottom with no points throughout the sprint races, where Alpine had a couple of, jumps, and Haas had that nice big jump, in that Belgium race, which put him up in that front runner spot, 4 points in the sprint races compared to those teams. So we're doing the same thing here. We're looking at the team and looking at all the GP races on where they score points and where those trend lines were for that scenario in the GP races. And so you can see that Alpine was getting worse throughout this season, whereas Haas was getting slightly better throughout the season, and Stake F1 was pretty consistent across the board, across the season on those GP races in that regard to the trend line. And of course, this is, going up at this point is where you would get the points. And so that's what you want to see is those higher end trend lines. And you can kind of get a glimpse of, where the teams got the points in their GP races in this graph. And of course, right next to it. So in this position where you can see the same information in a step graph where we can look at those three teams. And so you can see, Stake Sauber, the Kick Sauber car in that green was pretty slow with, just a couple of points at the beginning, and then started gaining some ground, overtaking Haas for that midsection of the season, but then got overtaken by the end by Haas in those GP race points, where Alpine kind of was on par with Stake early on, but then quickly just, fell off because of the other teams getting points and Alpine kind of staying behind them. And of course, this is just the GP races, which if you kind of look at here in a minute, you're going to have some really good eyes to see the difference. But when you compare those with the combined scores. So as I said, this is a comparison for the combined scores for those teams. So you'd have to really compare, figuring out where the differences are between this and just the GP races. I mean, you can see here that Alpine got a point or two, in Miami and some other spots that you were probably missing on the overall picture if you're just looking at the GP races. But you basically get the same, data and look at this. It didn't change that much based on the sprint races. So if you're looking at the back of the pack, the sprint races didn't really change the outcome drastically one way or the other on any point in time for these, teams. Again, this is just a step graph of that same data, so you'd have to go back and really compare those two different, graphs and look at those and figure out what the difference is. And here, basically what you could see here is that Alpine got ahead of Kick just slightly, in that Saudi Arabia error, where he gained just a couple points over, Kick because of those sprint races, whereas the other ones kind of worked their way out in that regard. And so if you're going to combine all those points together, that's kind of like shows you a little bit of difference, but it doesn't really affect the end results because of the complete bigger point ranges that come out at the end. So that gave you a nice, good deep dive view of some graphs and some information that you can pause and look at for the Stake Kick Sauber car and their team and the drivers and kind of compare those. So what's coming up next, we'll do the same thing, but with Haas and figure out where they end up comparative to the teams around them and the drivers, where they ended up in that drivers championship for the, Behrman and Ocon as well. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.